Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to your Classroom Hacks YouTube channel. This is the Classroom Hacks book review section, and this is typically where you will hear reviews for not just books, but podcasts, movies, shows, things that we are reviewing. And in this particular episode, we're going to do something a little different as we split up this discussion of the Coddling of the American Mind into two separate review/podcast episodes. Why we're doing that is because I found this book incredibly interesting, incredibly engaging, incredibly connected to my life as an educator, as a parent, and as someone who is dealing with many of the topics and scenarios that Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff talk about in the book. And so we're going to break this up into two separate sort of discussions. That's also just because I do want to go long form with this. I do think it is a very important book to discuss, as they have many of important topics to address and that they speak about. And the first particular review/podcast that I'm going to have here is going to focus on the education side of it. And then the second podcast will have a special guest with me on it. I will talk about the parental side of the discussion that they're having, because essentially the book does focus on both students and children. It is the coddling of the American mind, but it addresses the way in which not only kids are being raised, but the cycles and different things that are in place that are contributing to the quote-unquote coddling that is going on. But as always, before we get into this review, we are live from the Pantheon of Pedagogy, the Mecca of Methodology, your vacation from vacation with your educational excavators, where you can learn to seriously take teaching not so seriously. This is, and we are, Classroom Hacks. And this, as I said, was an extremely interesting listen. I felt very connected to a variety of different points in this book, as I've dealt with some of these discussions firsthand. Some of the other things that are brought up weren't necessarily directly connected to where I teach, or I have not seen first person. But as we get into this review and /podcast, we will talk about that a bit more. As always, I do want to give some background and synopsis for the Coddling of the American Mind, and this is coming from The Atlantic. And please be aware that there are some spoilers in this. Not that essentially this isn't like a Marvel movie where I'm going to spoil like the ending and everyone dies in Infinity War, but there are some points in here that kind of go in depth about what exactly the book is about. So again, here's a quick synopsis from The Atlantic in regards to the Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, where they argue that well-intentioned adults are unwittingly harming young people by raising them in ways that implicitly convey three untruths. One, the untruth of fragility. What doesn't kill you makes you weaker. Two, the untruth of emotional reasoning. Always trust your feelings. Three, the untruth of us versus them. Life is a battle between good people and evil people. In their telling, the spread of these untruths, especially in the middle and upper classes, helps to explain a spike in mental health problems among young people and recent tumult on the campuses of highly selective colleges. But if parents and educators change course, they argue they can raise happier, healthier kids who'll turn into better citizens. And so this is a brief sort of snapshot of what the book is about. And there was a lot of controversy from this book did generate, primarily because that we are living in a highly politicized time. As you probably heard, concepts like tribalism and things that Brene Brown has talked about in her book, Atlas of the Heart. This book is definitely going to be up there in terms of book of the year. It was not necessarily as, I should say, well written in my opinion, as Brene Brown's piece, depending on what you were looking for. But in terms of getting you thinking, in terms of connecting with you about topics or scenarios that you might have direct contact with, especially if you are an educator or especially if you are a parent, these are things that I have noticed in my day-to-day teaching, in my day-to-day life, and they definitely did hit a chord with me. And so those are some of the areas that I do want to address in this particular sort of discussion. And so when it comes to this idea of these untruths, one thing that I will say about the book is when Haidt is sort of reading into some of the anecdotes or the narrative, I should say, of the book, it's not necessarily as connective as when they're actually talking about the testimony and scenes that have actually played out in real life campuses. There were some points where I did question how anecdotal or just how much of this was observation based on particular areas or particular personal sort of circumstances that particular individuals have gone through. As I said, in my particular school, I have seen various sorts of discussions pertaining to gender, to race, to all sorts of different types of protests, but never to the extent that I've seen people try to protest against Milo Yiannopoulos or protest in other areas that have had more in-depth discussion and in-depth controversy that are going with these. But in regards to things like the untruth of fragility, this was something that really hit home with me, primarily because my wife and we actually do discuss the idea of raising our son, raising our next of kin, and seeing some of the things in the ways in which our nieces or our nephews have developed and what we're seeing in a lot of young kids, especially with our friends who are having kids of their own. And as I'm seeing myself in regards to some of these areas pertaining to young people, the idea that comes up in this book is, are we preparing the road for the student or the child for the road? I should say the road for the child or the child for the road. Now, this is where Haidt and Lukianoff sort of really put their bread and butter into this discussion, that the world is unfair, and instead of creating and thinking that kids are much weaker or much more fragile than they actually are, we should treat them not like weak candles who will get blown out the instant a breeze comes by, but these very strong, hot flames that need wind and oxygen to thrive and to survive. And so this particular dictum about preparing the child for the road, not the road for the child, was met with some controversy. Some people have indicated that the road is unfair for many young adults and many children who are born in less privileged circumstances. And to be fair, I do think that Haidt and Lukianoff do bring up an objective sort of idea. I don't think they disregard the idea of privilege, as many parts of the book do address many areas in which minorities, people of the LGBTQ plus community have been discriminated against. In fact, I do believe that Haidt does go on to suggest that he is more moderate left, middle left, if my memory serves me correctly. And so I was trying to do my best to go into this book without having any prior knowledge to this, because I did want to sort of objectively see if the piece does go one way or the other. And I will say, from what I listened to and what I heard, it does not come off that Haidt or Lukianoff go extremely one way or the other. They do address issues pertaining to individuals who go too far left, as long as individuals who go too far right. So they do address the issues with the extremes on both sides. But their main focus is to address how many of these other cycles that are coming into play are really going to be the proponents of what happens going forward with students and young adults and our children and our children's children. And so with this, they go on to address the untruth of emotional reasoning. Always trust your feelings. And why this is crucial to sort of address as well is that there is this idea that if we feel something, if we are offended by something, if we are made sad by something or made angry by something, that there's different people in our current culture who will try to perpetuate that, push that, really fan those flames and say, always trust that first initial visceral sort of feeling that you have. And one thing that Haidt and Lukianoff are trying to bring out in this idea of the coddling of the American mind is that we need to be more critical just in general, that emotion and many of the things that it appears that people on social media really run with are what are causing cancel culture and other sorts of call-out culture that are not necessarily always reasonable. So the idea of emotional reasoning, the emotion part of it, sort of overcompensating or overtaking the idea of logic, reasoning, and spirited debate. And then in the regards to the third untruth of us versus them, this is something that, as we've talked about with Brene Brown's piece, this also gets brought up here, this very tribalistic sort of approach is that if we are not 100% aligned with a particular group, then we are automatically the enemy, that we are automatically bad people, that if you only think this way, then that makes you good. Everything is black and white. There is no gray. And as an English teacher, as someone who prides himself on teaching critical thought and being open to having these sorts of discussions, I found that these three particular points were very crucial in the sort of development of this text. And why it's important to address these particular areas is because this is what I also try to speak about in my class. I want my students to have a sort of open environment to be able to talk about issues or feelings or topics that perhaps they haven't been able to address before. But I want them to also utilize the tools that we bring up in class, whether that's personal narrative, whether that's exploration, whether that's analysis, evaluation, argumentation, or proposal, and utilize those tools as they come along throughout the semester and apply them to many of these things. And so it is a process, but I can definitely understand how the culture and the media and technology have all sort of come together, compressed, and sort of put everything in a mold that is not going to be very easy to dismantle or untangle. And we have a lot of different tools that allow us to propel our thoughts. And if we think about how petitions used to be done decades ago, that you would need to go house to house, or you need to send out mail, and you need to get people to petition to get something done or make a change to something. However, because of the rise of social media and platforms like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, what have you, that something that used to take months can be done in seconds, especially when something starts to trend or go viral, hashtag it, it goes all over the internet, and people create a buzz over something, and then this wave that's title and scope goes out and takes out whatever is in its path. And then a lot of times the people who started the wave don't really look back at the chaos or the destruction that had taken place, and then they move on to the next thing. And so this is where I think Haidt and Lukianoff want to say, especially for students, to take a moment to really take in and digest a lot of the things that you are hearing, a lot of the things that you are becoming exposed to, especially on a college campus. I think one of the areas that they definitely highlight is how many campuses, which I thought was extremely interesting, how you need to have this sort of ratio of conservative and liberal minds. And typically, the ratio shouldn't topple over from too many of one and not enough of the other. But they typically say, I believe it was either 3-2 or 3-1 ratio of liberal to conservative. But if you start to go too much into one direction, then The oppositional side doesn't necessarily have as much of a stake or a voice in these discussions. And then the only sort of platforms and the only sort of agendas that are being taken on are the side that obviously has the majority, the overwhelming majority, I should say. And some people might ask, well, what's wrong with having liberal or progressive sort of thoughts? Well, not that there's not anything necessarily wrong, but the idea of equality and equity and fairness in regards to some of these discussions and the extremeness of how some of these sort of conversations take place is where I think Haidt and Lukianoff are trying to say that this is what becomes problematic, is that we don't necessarily have balance or equity in some of these discussions, that you're only going to have this one side, and that side is always going to be seen as 100% right, justified, accurate, and must be done. Otherwise, you're deemed as harmful or even as an enemy. And this, at the core of what they're saying, goes against every sort of collegiate, academic, institutional sort of foundation that we are trying to instill with our students, especially when it comes to critical thought, that there shouldn't just be this sort of one-sided area that says this is how it's going to be and this is what you need to take from this class. There should be no other means of discussion. There should be no other means of conversation. Now, to be fair, as I've seen in my classes, typically, as time goes on, I've been an educator for over 10 years now, and just with the times and with culture in education and in the U.S. in general and the world, we just are more progressive. We get more progressive, especially because as each generation comes along, there are more progressive ideas. Technology is created to make things easier. More people are given rights. There's less sort of bigotry and prejudice and things, but it doesn't mean that those things still don't exist. But it doesn't also necessarily mean that a progression to an extreme extent is something that everyone is going to be on board with. And that's just the way of the world. When new technology comes out, not everyone is just going to clamor for the most new iPhone or the newest Android or the newest social media platform. And this is the same thing that can be said about concepts or ideas. And this is one of those things where people who are fighting for some of these freedoms and some of these liberties and some of these points of equality and equity that they have been disregarded for the long time, whether that's minorities, whether that's people in the LGBTQ plus community, they want a lot of those things, and they feel that they are owed those things, which they are, but there's also a sort of learning curve that does need to take place. And it doesn't necessarily mean that at one point, not that this will never happen, that people will take on and take to a cause, but as even my own students have told me, and I teach, like I said, freshmen and sophomores in college, that even they are understanding that it is very, very hard to change generational mindset, meaning that their parents and their grandparents who grew up in a different time have only had certain exposure to certain things, have not had the education or the speed of education in which material can be ingested and understood and accepted as this generation has. Because think about it. When our parents or our grandparents went to school, the only way that they would really consume information would be what they received in a classroom or what they read in books if they read books on their own time or watched on TV. However, modern students and modern children and young adults can consume media anytime, anywhere, from a variety of different sources, voices, and different points of influence. And there are so many groups and so many organizations and so many points of support for people who need to find a place to belong, that this was not how it was for our parents, for my generation, for our grandparents and great-grandparents. And so that sort of conceptualization, that sort of understanding does require time. And one thing that Haidt and Lukyanov try to address is that if you try to force someone's hand to strong arm them into believing in your cause, even if it is a just cause, that people are going to be more defensive. People are going to be much more adverse to not wanting to listen or be turned off to your particular protest or proposal. And this is why, especially in classes that I teach, I want to have, and I know the term safe space gets thrown around, and depending on what side of the aisle you are on, it's either going to be looked at as this joke sort of concept or this concept that needs to be brought up and needs to be upheld. But a place at least where students have the opportunity to speak, even if their ideas aren't agreed upon. And a classroom, especially at the college level or at any level, should really be a place for open discussion, open debate, open understanding, without just the rupturing of our vocal cords because we're yelling at each other from across the aisle on social media, behind anonymity, and in all these different areas. And it's a fascinating thing when you see it unravel in person. I've seen students who have had that eureka moment in class when they've had some of these conversations about gender, when they've had some of these conversations about economics, when they've had some of these conversations about race and understanding where their classmates are coming from. I've had students who've developed projects where they've told me at the end of the semester, I've never had the opportunity to talk about my sexuality, or I've never had the opportunity to talk about addiction, or I've never had the opportunity to talk about leaving a war-torn country or a socialist or communist country to come here and to change my life entirely. And this is the type of atmosphere that I'm trying to raise, because I do think that students are fully capable of bringing those ideas to light, especially if you give them a place where they don't feel like they're going to be judged, or they don't feel like they're going to be turned away, or that their voices do matter, that it makes it much easier for them to sort of open up about these things. And so that idea of students not being as fragile as our culture is making them out to be, I back that 100%. That, as Brene Brown suggests, that there needs to be a little bit of discomfort when it comes to learning, because learning isn't always going to be comfortable. That's really where curiosity comes from, is the idea of getting through that muck and then finding out what is on the other side, and then having that eureka moment, and then having the passion to continue to go further with some of this. And the book goes on to discuss, Haidt and Lukyanov's book, The Coddling of the American Mind, goes on to talk about how this fragility is sort of framed, because despite all metrics that we are living in the safest time in the history of the world, not just by medical standards, not just by social standards or economic standards, but just because it's just the way it is. We don't do things that are particularly unsafe as they used to be. As I did the earlier review this year of Tara Westover's Educated, and the way that just her family did certain things, especially when it came to construction, you could see how unsafe some of those practices were. But as a culture and as the world has progressed, we found out ways to be safer, how to identify different things, whether that's in law enforcement, whether that's in sports, whether that's with medical protocol. The idea of being unsafe is so distant from what it was a decade, 2 decades ago, that it's a completely different world. But yet, for some reason, according to the book and just from my own observations, we are believing that the time that we are in now is that anything can happen, that there are so many other things that are making our world so devastatingly scary that we need to protect our children and our students' minds and bodies from being violently taken over by some either benevolent force, some media force, or something else. And I don't disagree that there is high-level manipulation that goes on in different areas from both sides of the aisle, that the right is just as powerful with getting certain ideas across as the left is, but we have to be critical of how both sides present this sort of discussion and argument. And so what I try to look at in class is not necessarily always just the argument that's being had, the idea, because it's very easy to get swept up in concepts and what we feel is just and right, because that is crucial. But what's just as crucial is the way in which some of these ideas are being presented to us, the way in which media sort of puts it into our heads. And the idea that when you have certain media platforms, big tech primarily, has these platforms that are very, very powerful tools in getting over certain ideas. And that's good in one sense because you want many people to be as informed as they can, but to completely also have the power to shut off anyone else who might have an alternative perspective is also very scary. And then you might say, well, they need to be shut off because they're going to give people false information, misinformation, or they're going to cause harm to people. That is very well true. But until that particular position happens to you or to your particular party or to your particular agenda, it's going to be a bit overwhelming when you see how the tides turn. So that's why there needs to be a crucial understanding and a critical understanding from young adults, kids, students, that we can't just take everything for face value. And that kind of is the core of sort of dismantling the untruth of us versus the untruth of them, which Haidt and Lukianoff go to address in a variety of different areas. We see this in many different demonstrations as they talk about how schools that were predominantly liberal went about doing their protests completely shutting down any sort of conversation from any administrative force and really holding rank and file the way that they wanted to do it, and shutting out people from having discussions or even having open debates about different things. And I do particular lessons in class about asking my students if they were to set up criteria for what they feel would be fair or appropriate measures to have a speaker come to campus. The majority of my students do say that campus should be open for anyone to speak, but the criteria they come up with, I think, are very illuminating in terms of what they feel is an appropriate way to measure how someone speaks. So, for example, I've had students in the past who have said there obviously needs to be background checks to kind of determine what is the speaker coming to the school to do. Is there a book that's coming out for them? So, for example, when Milo Yiannopoulos would go on his particular tours, you would see that he might get more controversial right before the release of a particular book. Coincidence? I don't know. But those would be one of those background checks to kind of determine, well, what is this person really coming here for? Also, how knowledgeable is this person in terms of their research? What sort of background do they have in this discussion? And then a way to make it fair is, instead of just having one speaker from one particular side of the conversation have this discussion, have multiple speakers in like back-to-back weeks. So for out an entire month, you have 4 speakers, 2 for one side of the discussion, or 1 for one side, 1 for another, 1 in the middle, and then an arbitrary person to sort of wrap things up, to kind of get a full comprehensive perspective on what the discussion is about. And those sort of criteria that my students came up with on their own, I think, is sort of a telling idea of how they sort of see the world. And so the idea of taking and dismantling the untruth of us versus them, I think that is going to happen in classrooms if we are given the opportunity to have those spaces, to have these discussions. We also need to critique and be more critical of how we view our media. And the media does need to be held more accountable for the things that they talk about and the things that they are able to speak on. But at the core of a lot of this is the power that social media has, and that everyone is at the direct pulse of any particular social media platform at any given time. And those are those things that are going to take a lot more sort of critical viewing and observation than perhaps we have the ability to do as an individual. So we would obviously need more research and time dedicated to sort of look at those things. This is why I said I needed to probably break this up into two sort of discussions. This was part one of the Coddling of the American Mind review. I don't even really know how much of a review that was, as much as it was just sort of me kind of going through the three untruths and trying to couple that with what I've seen in my own class. Like I said, Haidt and Lukianov really do a good job of shedding light on some of these particular areas. And I think as a recommendation, I would say go through the book yourself, read it, give it a listen, give it a read, and kind of make any connections that you have as an educator to sort of see, do these pieces really fit, or are these only happening in certain pockets of the country? Because I will say that many of the things that they've addressed happens in my class, maybe not always to the degree that they're talking about, but definitely to the point where it does hit home with you, primarily because we're seeing a shift in times, and it is up to us as educators and the guides of many of these young minds to sort of not give in to some of the pressures that sometimes the outside world can weigh in on us, that we have to be able to be the flag bearers for some of these areas and be able to be the open doors and gateways for these young minds to have that space to talk about these things. This is what college should be about. This is what the idea of going to university or going to college was for many people, to be exposed to many different points of views, educated points of views, different students from different backgrounds, and to have the brightest minds come together to talk about topics that maybe you don't always get to talk about in your own hometown. And this is one of those books that really addresses that and addresses how we are approaching an impasse in our culture with many of the cycles that are in place and many of the barriers that are also coming up as well. I will probably may even make this three potentially different reviews, as I do know there are a lot of other specific parts of the book that I would like to touch on. This kind of ended up being more of a rant than anything. But the next time we meet in terms of this particular review, like I said, I'm going to break this up. This was more of the educational side of the discussion. The next review for this and the next podcast will be for the parental side of the discussion. And then I think I'll make the third podcast in regards to this particular book, the specific protests and the specific areas of the book that Haidt and Lukianov talk about, where we see some of these extreme circumstances happening and sort of break them down and dismantle them. So I hope this was enlightening for those of you who were able to listen to this. I do apologize if it did come off more as a rant. I did have a lot to say when it came to this because, like I said, I really was as I drove and I listened, and then right after I listened, I went to class and I saw some of these things again, as I have for the last decade. It really was a sort of it was sort of a moment that just was surreal, because you hear it and then you see it again, and then you make those connections and they just go back and forth like a pendulum, and then you try to get it all out with some of these reviews. And so, as always, fellow hacks, it is never goodbye. It is until we meet again. And the next time for our next review, like I said, we're going to move on over to the parental side of this discussion. And until then, Avita Zen, have a good one, everybody.